All right, good evening, everybody. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Brian Franklin. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Presidential History here at SMU, and I have the privilege of emceeing our event this evening. We really appreciate you coming out to support us, to support our speaker tonight. I think you're going to really be glad that you did. Maybe just a couple of things to make you aware of, especially if you are new to CPH. Here at the Center for Presidential History, we really have three big arms of things we do. One is this kind of thing, public engagement, inviting people to come speak about their work, producing podcasts, engaging with schools around the Dallas area. We also support research, and that comes in many ways, the research of some of the faculty here at SMU. Also, our postdoctoral fellowship program, where people who have finished their PhDs from all over the country will come here and spend a couple of years with us, incubating, producing, and then going off and doing great things, as you will see tonight with our speaker. And then third, we have our Collective Memory Project, which is really a filmed oral history where we film interviews with people from during the George W. Bush era, people from the government, people from the press, really trying to explore deeply firsthand testimony of what it was people were doing during that time, so that those who are studying it now and those who study in the future will be able to have access to this sort of firsthand testimony of what people were doing and why they were doing it. So we really appreciate you taking part in part of this here tonight and being part of the public that we're trying to engage. I want to tell you about, finally, just our last event that's going to be coming up in just a couple of weeks on May 9th. Be engaged tonight, but also sign up for our last event of the year, May 9th. We're welcoming Beverly Gage, the Pulitzer Prize-winning writer of her brand new book, G-Man, which is a biography of J. Edgar Hoover, kind of the story of the FBI. We welcome you to join us. It'll be a great event, and also we have every intention of announcing some of our lineup for next year, which I can't tell you now, but I'm really excited about, and just really nerdy excited about. So join us there if you want to get a sneak preview about that. Well, let's jump in for tonight. I want to introduce our guest for tonight, Dr. Blake Earle. Blake went to one of the universities in Texas that's in Austin for undergraduate. I went to graduate school at Texas A&M, in case you didn't know. And then did his PhD at Rice University, a fellow sort of native Texan traveling all over the state, before he came here for 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow, where we just had a great time with him here. And after leaving here, he went off to what on paper, and I hope in person, although I won't claim too much for him, was just the absolute perfect job for him at Texas A&M Galveston, which, by the way, has one of the most descriptive and fun Twitter handles of all, Aggies by the Sea. And he's been at Texas A&M Galveston for several years. In fact, he's been there long enough now that just this week, I believe, he submitted his application and process for earning tenure at A&M Galveston, which is wonderful. We congratulate him for that. He has published really widely on all sorts of topics. He's got an amazingly titled article in the Journal of the Early Republic called For Cod and Country. And then jumped way forward in time to write a book about something called tanker surfing in Galveston Bay, which involves, if you haven't been to our coastline here in the beautiful state of Texas, then you'll know that it doesn't usually have the biggest waves. It's not Hawaii or something like that. But every once in a while, when a literal tanker pulls into the bay, there are giant waves, and there's a whole sport around surfing these waves. And it's this very strange bedfellows matchup of environmental sport and oil tankers. It's pretty incredible stuff. And now he's working on a book about fishing and fishermen in the Gulf Coast, Texas Gulf Coast in the 20th century, all centered around this story of a murder involving the conflict between white fishermen and Vietnamese fishermen on the Gulf Coast in the 1970s. It's incredible stuff. I could talk all day about all this interesting stuff. But I really just want to introduce him for tonight. He's going to be talking to us about his first book, pretty recently published with Cornell Press, called The Liberty to Take Fish. I won't say any more because I won't say it even remotely as well as he's going to. So please welcome with me Dr. Blake Earle.
Thank you. All right. righty. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Brian. Honestly, you make my other work sound far more interesting than what I'm going to be talking about tonight, but hopefully we can have some fun here. All right, so I do want to extend my thanks to the CPH for inviting me here. Thank you to Brian, thank you to Rana for organizing, putting all of this together. I am not going to be thanking Jeff this evening because he did not bother to show up. All right, so I want to start off, I guess, with a fair warning that I'm not going to be talking too much about presidents or the presidency. I know that may be a bit of a disappointment since, after all, this is the Center for Presidential History, but hopefully what I can show tonight, hopefully what I can convince you of, is that oftentimes we really need to look beyond the kind of great man narrative of history to get a fuller, richer, and more accurate understanding of the past. Because it is not these presidents that I am most interested in. In fact, I think I'm only going to be mentioning one president tonight, Millard Fillmore, naturally. Instead, what I'm interested in is fish. Fish, not these great men, are key to my understanding of the past. And the point that I'm trying to make here tonight is that our understanding of history is necessarily incomplete without taking into consideration the forces, the energy of the non-human world. And even something as intensely human an endeavor as politics and diplomacy should not, indeed cannot, be understood without a consideration of that environmental context. And to do that, I will actually start off with one of those great men, Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster was one of the most prominent politicians in antebellum America. Of course, never became president despite running and losing in 1836, and actually he was preparing to run again for president in 1852 before he died. But of course, he is known for his decades-long run in the Senate. Famously, his 1830 reply to Hayne gave us one of our most kind of articulate expressions of unionism during the 19th century, liberty and union now and forever, one and inseparable. But it's his time as Secretary of State that's of most interest to me. He served two different stints as one of the nation's chief diplomats, first in the 1840s, and then again under Millard Fillmore from 1850 to 1852, which is where our story picks up. So in the summer of 1852, as Webster is nearing the end of his career in public service, and also when he's nearing the end of his life. He would die before the year was out. But in July of 1852, he would return to his home in Marshfield, Massachusetts, hoping to escape the oppressive heat of the Washington, D.C. summer. And when he arrived home to his home in Marshfield, it's a little bit south of Boston, he was met by a crowd of locals welcoming this distinguished statesman home. And as certainly was custom at the time, it was expected for him to give a speech to the crowd that had gathered. And so the topic that he selected to talk about, the address that he gave, was about something that was near and dear to the hearts of this community just a few miles from where the North Atlantic lapped the shores of the Bay State. He was there to talk about fishing. And this was kind of a hot time for fishing in the North Atlantic, or at least for the politics surrounding fishing in the North Atlantic, because earlier that summer, the British had informed the United States that it was going to begin strictly enforcing a decades-old treaty that forbade Americans from fishing within 3 miles of the coast of Britain's remaining North American colonies in Canada. This meant that hundreds of American fishermen ran the risk of capture at the hands of the British Navy for fishing in these forbidden waters, really for just doing their job. And so this declaration was met with a good degree of trepidation among the fishermen across New England, but it was also met with a great deal of outrage because it seemed as though the British were depriving the nation of its rights. It seemed as though the British were running roughshod over the liberty to take fish that Americans had enjoyed since independence in the 1780s. And so, as Webster addressed his crowd, he certainly was aware of the interest that this community had in the fisheries, and he wanted to reassure these Americans that the federal government would stand by their side. The federal government would continue to do what it had done for decades, and that is defend and protect the rights of Americans to fish the North Atlantic. You may be rest assured, he told the audience in Massachusetts, it is a subject upon which no one sleeps in Washington. He certainly extolled the economic value of the fisheries to the region and to the nation, but he also hit on another theme about how important the fisheries were to the history of the nation, even saying that national security itself was directly tied to this economic resource out in the ocean, the fisheries. He said that our fisheries have been the very nurseries of our Navy. If our flagships have conquered the enemy on the sea, the fisheries are at the bottom of it. The fisheries were the seeds from which these glorious triumphs were born in spring. So he's saying that national glory here was directly tied to this resource that was now under attack from the British. And in perhaps the most stirring part of the speech, a phrase that no doubt resonated with this seaside audience, Webster declared that the fishermen shall be protected in all their rights of property and in all their rights of occupation, hook and line, bob and sinker. So he's saying that the federal government was really going to go to the mat for these fishermen to defend their lives, to defend their livelihoods because of the value, not just economic, of the fisheries to the nation. And so this, really begs the question here, and a question that I pose at the outset of my book, is that why was Webster, one of the most prominent men in America, during the summer of 1852, less than a decade before the Civil War would tear the nation asunder, so concerned with fish? And during that summer, we saw the production of a number of political cartoons that directly oriented Webster on the same side as the fishermen. Is this a pointer? Is this a pointer? Does it?
Yes, it should be. There's like a red, maybe like a...
There we go. Right, so we have Daniel Webster here, right alongside the fishermen, toiling against the British to defend that right. And so the question becomes, why? Why were Americans, why was Webster so concerned with fish at this juncture? And the answer to this is really the major argument that I put forward in this book that I wrote. And simply, for these early Americans in the period from the era of the American Revolution through the American Civil War era, the fisheries were a measure of liberty and independence. For these early Americans, access to the fisheries was tantamount to political independence. And this kind of connection in the minds of early Americans goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War. The origins, the course, the conclusion of the Revolutionary War was directly tied to the fisheries. When Americans, or at least when people in Massachusetts made the decision to sue for independence, to break away from the British Empire, much of their thinking was related to the fisheries. In the year before, The Battle of Lexington and Concord. British Parliament forbade American fishermen from fishing in the North Atlantic. And for many of these soon-to-be American citizens, this was the last straw. This was indicative of the kind of heavy-handed manner in which the British were treating the Americans. And then the course of the war also very much so depended upon the fisheries. In the summer of 1775, the first American warship put under the flag of what would become the United States was in fact a converted cod fishing schooner, the Hannah. And then after the war, American diplomats were certainly cognizant of this contribution that these fishermen and the fishing industry had made to the course of American independence. So when the British and the American delegation met in Paris to hammer out this treaty that would conclude the war, the American delegation, led by John Adams, a Massachusetts native, sought to acknowledge, to defend, to protect, to uphold the continued right of these American fishermen to continue fishing in the North Atlantic. And so Article 3 of the Treaty of Paris directly recognized this right, this liberty of Americans to continue fishing in the North Atlantic. So here at this birthing moment for the United States, we see this direct connection being made between independence and the fisheries. The inhabitants of the United States shall have liberty to take fish of every kind on such part of the coast of Newfoundland as British fishermen shall use, and also on the coasts, bays, creeks of all other of His Britannic Majesty's dominions in America. So for these early Americans, for the next century or so, this idea was a potent one in American politics, because the fisheries were not just this economic resource. The fisheries were not just mere fish. The fisheries were a measure, were a symbol, were a talisman of political independence. And so the fisheries then become this great prism to study so much about the development of the early American state. And much of my book is concerned with tracking how the maturation of federal power was in some ways very much so tied to this project here of defending, supporting, and upholding American access to those fisheries. And while this may seem to be somewhat of an esoteric concern of just one region of the United States, it really was a national question. We can look at everything from the development of federalism to the maturation of the Commerce Department, even to the operation of the U.S. Navy. All of these things were in some ways tied back to the fisheries. But for tonight, and really for much of this book, it is the realm of foreign relations that we really see the clearest example of how federal power was used to support and defend the fisheries. Because it's not as though the Treaty of Paris in 1783 did away with this question, did away with this issue. For more than a century, American and British diplomats would go to the bargaining table again and again and again to adjudicate a series of disputes that were in some ways related to the fisheries. In 1783, in 1815, in 1818, 1842, 1854, 1871, 1877, 1883, and finally in 1910, British and American diplomats were talking about fish. And so clearly, what we see here is that the federal government was quite willing to use its power to defend this business, because it was so much more than just a business. And another story that we can take away from this series of treaties is the importance of taking into consideration non-human actors. Because as these British and American diplomats were hammering out their differences, as they were attempting to draw these neat lines out in the ocean saying where Americans could or could not fish, of course the fish themselves did not abide by those agreements. They didn't even know they existed. And so what this story that I'm going to tell here tonight can help us understand is the necessity of including that element, including the non-human world in this story. And it also helps us understand the shortcomings of diplomacy that failed to take into consideration those actors. Part of the reason why these American and British diplomats had to go to the bargaining table again and again and again is because they failed to appreciate the dynamic environment, the fact that the environment was constantly changing, so that these diplomatic agreements were very often out of date the second they were signed because of environmental change, because of environmental shifts. All right. So back to the summer of 1852, when Webster made his promise that the federal government would protect those fishermen, hook and line, bob and sinker. And it's at this point that the North Atlantic itself was in a state of change, and it was changing ecologically in a way that would foster conflict between these two nations. And this change really centered on the decline of the cod fishery and the rise of the mackerel fishery. So if you'll bear with me here, I'm going to talk a little bit about ecology. So there are two main species of fish that we are talking about here. First is the Atlantic cod, Gatus morwa. So this is the fish that had for decades, for centuries, been a mainstay of the New England economy. This was the fish that, really attracted some of the earliest explorers and settlers to the Northwest Atlantic many centuries ago. This was the fish that would sustain the development of the fishing industry in New England in the 1600s and into the 1700s. This was, the fish upon which much of the economy of New England was simply built. And so the cod is a decidedly non-migratory species. It is not a fish that moves around a whole lot. It is largely confined to the stretch of waters from Cape Cod to about New England. So these are relatively cold waters. And the cod, because of its ecological niche, largely spends most of its life cycle far offshore in the benthic environment. So it basically lives the majority of its life far removed from the coast in the very bottom of the sea. That'll be important for us here in a moment. So while we have the cod, this non-migratory benthic-dwelling species, on the other hand, we have the mackerel. So the mackerel was a very fickle fish. It moved around a lot, highly migratory, ranging as far south as the Carolinas and as far north as Greenland. It moved around a whole lot, and so this meant it was kind of a difficult fish to count on. It would have been very difficult for New Englanders to build their economy on a resource this fickle. Years of huge landings would be followed by bust years of very low landings. There was a great degree of fluctuation in the mackerel fishery. So that's one important distinction between the cod and the mackerel. Another important distinction concerns where it lives. Whereas the cod is living far offshore, the mackerel lives much closer in to the shore. And this, as I said here, will be very important for us here in a moment. So we have this situation here in which there's this offshore-dwelling cod species, this inshore-dwelling mackerel species. And for centuries, fishermen had preferred the cod here, yet things start to change in the middle decades of the 19th century. And a lot of this has to do with large-scale climatic shifts. The middle decades of the 19th century comes as the last gasp of what climatological scientists called the Little Ice Age. It's this centuries-long period going back to the 1400s and the 1500s in which global temperatures, especially in the northern hemisphere, were much lower than they had been during the earlier medieval warm period. And so the middle decades of the 19th century see kind of the Little Ice Age come back with a vengeance. Temperatures across the northern hemisphere, across the North Atlantic, kind of go down dramatically. And so this cooling period has a significant impact on these fish. After all, much of the life cycle of the fish, from its growth to its spawning to its eating, pretty much everything that a fish does is affected by water temperature. And so this cooling trend is devastating for the cod population. Unlike the mackerel that can overwinter in much warmer waters further south, the cod largely stay put, and we see the cod population fall pretty dramatically during the second quarter of the 19th century, the couple decades leading up to the 1850s. Meanwhile, the mackerel largely avoid the most devastating impacts of this cooling trend, and so comparatively, there are more mackerel than there was cod by the middle part of the 19th century. There's also some changes in the fishing industry and the fishing market. New England fishermen develop more effective techniques for catching mackerel, and there is just a much bigger demand for mackerel in the American economy during this time, largely because New Englanders devised a way to extract more oil, more fish oil from the fish here. So there's all these reasons that kind of come together from the 1820s to the 1850s to foster the growth of the mackerel business. And we kind of get a little sense of that in this graph here. So the top line shows the tonnage. That is, how many ships are out there fishing for cod. The bottom line shows how many ships are out there fishing for mackerel. And in this period here, we see mackerel catches just go up dramatically to the point where they're very close to cod here. If we look at export numbers, we get a better sense of just how big of a shift that there was. So in the year 1800, the United States exports 400,000 barrels of cod. In 1850, that number had dropped to 150,000, so less than half. Meanwhile, over that same period, exports of mackerel grow from 8,000 barrels to 300,000 barrels. So we have this really, really major shift here in the fishing industry, as now mackerel is beginning to supplant king cod as this kind of important economic resource. And this would prove to be a problem for the politicians, because the treaties, the agreements that governed this business assumed that Americans would be fishing for cod and not for mackerel. And the treaty that was in effect in 1852 was the Convention of 1818, this deal signed some decades before, in which the United States and Great Britain agreed that American fishermen would no longer would be allowed to fish within 3 miles of the coast of British North America. So those coastal waters, those waters that are now increasingly valuable because they are the home to these rich schools of mackerel, are now off limits diplomatically, politically, legally to American fishermen. So as you can already see here, this environmental context is essential if we want to understand the origins of the conflict here, because this shift from cod fishing to mackerel fishing, a shift that was in some ways precipitated by these climatological changes, set the stage for the dispute, for the conflict that we would see in the summer of 1852. So that's kind of the long-term origins of this dispute in 1852. The shorter-term causes have to do with international trade policies, something very, very exciting. So in the 1840s, the British government, for a whole set of reasons we won't really get into here, made the decision to adopt free trade. No longer would the British government have this series of restrictive, mercantilist laws that impose a lot of restrictions on what nations could trade with the British or with British colonies. And so this was celebrated, this was hailed in Britain as this kind of enlightened step that would modernize the British economy by adopting these new, trendy, modern ideas like free trade. This would, however, be really bad for Britain's remaining colonies in North America, that is to say, Canada. Because now the British could much more cheaply import the same things that Canada produced, mainly timber, fish, coal, and wheat, from other countries for much cheaper. So free trade meant that Canadian exports were no longer that competitive. So this was a real problem for the empire. So to get around this issue, the British wanted the United States to strike a trading deal, a reciprocity deal with the Canadians, meaning that the United States would import Canadian goods and Canada would import American goods. And initially, for years, American leaders balked at this idea because it simply did not make economic sense. In fact, Daniel Webster refused to go along with these wishes here, and in 1850, he remarked to the British minister in Washington that such a deal, such a reciprocity agreement, quote, seems much more advantageous to Canada than to us, since we give her a large market and she gives us a small one for articles which are the common products of both. So this kind of free trade directive coming out of London falls on deaf ears in Washington. And by 1852, British leaders had grown tired of American foot dragging, had grown tired of the United States refusing to follow the British lead on this issue. And so it was in that summer of 1852 that British leaders realized they could use the fisheries issue as a way to force the United States into granting this reciprocity deal with the Canadians. So in July of 1852, British leaders indicated that ships of the Royal Navy would be stationed in North Atlantic waters in order to oversee this strict interpretation of the Convention of 1818 that forbade Americans from fishing within those inshore waters. Waters, again, that I remind you, are more valuable than ever because of the mackerel industry. And what would emerge at the heart of this dispute was this body of water here, the Bay of Fundy. So Americans insisted that despite this strict interpretation of the Convention of 1818, they could still legally fish in these kind of large bays and inlets, that the bulk of the Bay of Fundy was still open to American fishermen. The British, on the other hand, declared that this 3-mile line did not extend from the coastline of the Bay of Fundy, but instead extended from the headlands. So there was a 3-mile line from the mouth of the Bay of Fundy that American fishermen were now forbade from fishing in. So the Bay of Fundy really emerges as this kind of hot zone of this particular set of problems. And so Webster immediately saw the threats posed by this decision on the part of the British to strictly enforce this ban on inshore fishing. The immediate effect, Webster said, of British ships in North American waters will be the loss of the valuable fall fishing to American fishermen, a complete interruption of this extensive fishing business of New England, and constant collisions threatening the peace of the two countries. So Webster here is suggesting that this conflict, this dispute over these fisheries could devolve into something much larger, could perhaps even devolve into war. And so this naturally ignited a firestorm among American politicians who almost uniformly, North, South, Democrat, Whig, denounced this heavy-handed attempt on the part of the British that really seemed to call into question whether or not the British even respected American independence. And here we get back to this idea that the fisheries are this symbol of American independence. So as the British, it seems, are attempting to take away this right, they are attempting, in the minds of so many Americans, to take away American independence. In the ensuing debate in Congress over what actions the Fillmore administration should take, a senator from Virginia remarked that a far higher offense than a breach of national courtesy has occurred. An insult and an indignity to the American people was this British decision. Another senator from Arkansas remarked that has it ever before in the whole history of our country, from the day when our independence was acknowledged by Great Britain until this administration, that negotiations have been opened with us through the medium of cannon pointed against our citizens and our ships? Of course, no, was the answer. It seemed as though Britain was operating in an uncharacteristically heavy-handed way that seemed to call into question their acceptance of American independence. The popular press likewise commented on events that were unfolding, and papers across the nation uniformly pointed to this perceived feeling of indignity on the part of the British, that the British were making this decision not because of these issues surrounding free trade, but the British were making these decisions because they were jealous of the rising power of the United States. A newspaper in Boston remarked that this action exhibited a soreness at witnessing the growth of the Republican spirit among the inhabitants of British America, and have declared it as their opinion that nothing but a timely war with the United States would save the colonies to Great Britain. A paper in Baltimore remarked that we know that the rapid advance of the United States in prosperity and importance is regarded with jealous eyes in Britain. Beneath the courtesies of national intercourse, we discern the cordial hate of despotisms. But perhaps the most entertaining responses to this dispute came from the political cartoonists of the United States. So during that summer, the nation's most prolific political cartoonist, a guy named Edward Williams Clay, produced this image here, John Bull's Fish Monopoly. And what we have here is this stock character that was common in American culture during this time named Brother Jonathan. He was kind of this representation of the United States as a kind of cantankerous farm boy who was willing to stand up to John Bull here, this representation of the United States. And off to the side here, we have this kind of foppish Easterner, we have this rustic frontiersman who both agree that the United States must stand up for their rights to this indignity heaped upon the United States by Britain refusing to recognize the terms of these earlier treaties. And then here off to the side, we see the real costs of these decisions. This is a fisherman out of work, no longer able to ply his trade out in the North Atlantic because of these British policies. He is left only with his wife and daughter to console him, as soon enough poverty would sweep those who were formerly engaged in the fishing business. Elsewhere, we have this other depiction of the American political community, as we have a fisherman, an African-American, and a German-American all debating what was the appropriate response to this British indignity, and they almost all uniformly suggest that the United States must stand up, perhaps even going to war. And it's also interesting to keep in mind that 1852 would be a presidential election year. So kind of the backdrop to all of this is the campaign leading up to the election in November. And over here on the far right side, we have kind of a stereotypical Irishman from the period who's expressing this idea that the Democratic president or Democratic nominee, Franklin Pierce, if elected, would easily settle this issue, an issue that the Whig Millard Fillmore was incapable of solving. So we see how partisan politics infiltrates its way into this question here. So while there was plenty of talk from politicians, from the press, from ordinary Americans, actual action was a little bit slower. The most substantive response that the Fillmore administration had was to send American Naval Commander Matthew C. Perry aboard his ship, the USS Mississippi, to the region with the ostensible goal of protecting American lives and property should actual hostilities break out. And we can read something into the symbolic nature of this. After all, Perry was the most distinguished naval leader in the nation at the time. Of course, the brother of Oliver Hazard Perry, the hero of the War of 1812. Perry was kind of the grand old man of the Navy at this time, really important person in naval history. And the USS Mississippi was one of the most modern warships in the American fleet, the nation's first ocean-going steam-powered vessel. Actually, in fact, later that year, Perry would command the Mississippi on his famous cruise to Japan that would establish diplomatic and economic relations between Japan and the United States. But before that, Perry was sent to the waters of the North Atlantic with the goal of protecting American lives and property and reporting back to Washington what he noticed. And the report that Perry sent back was as much about the fish as it was the fishermen. Upon arriving on the scene and cruising on the waters that were, quote, most frequented resorts of the American fishermen in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and elsewhere, Perry concluded that the great number of American vessels were engaged in the mackerel fishery. So he very much so recognized that it was mackereling, not cod fishing, that was kind of at the heart of this conflict here. And Perry likewise recognized the political consequences of this fact that mackereling, not cod fishing, was now the kind of primary economic activity of Americans. He remarked in this report back to Washington that the mackerel usually resort in shoal to the bays and indents of the coasts, leaving fishermen little choice but to pursue their catch to the imaginary line that demarcated Britain's exclusive water. But as to be expected, in the engrossing and exciting occupation of taking them in thousands with the hook, they frequently follow the fish into forbidden waters, doubtless in many instances when the weather is thick or hazy and when distances computed by the eye are deceptive. So Perry, from this perspective out on the water, recognized how these changes in the environment that, of course, he was not aware of. He was not familiar with the Little Ice Age or the kind of centuries-long climactic history here, but he was able to witness firsthand the consequences of those changes, and that is this growth of the mackerel fishing industry. And as American fishermen are out there, they have little concern for these imaginary lines drawn on the ocean when it comes to making money. That catching these mackerel, even if it meant invading these forbidden waters, was worth the risk. And so as we can see here, it was not the vindictiveness of the British, as newspapers across the country suggested, that created this controversy in the summer of 1852. Instead, it was the fish. Mackerel lured American fishermen to cross that invisible 3-mile line and created the necessary preconditions for this conflict. American fishermen were only pursuing these fish because of the decline of the cod fishery, the rise of the mackerel fishery, all of this downstream from these natural fluctuations in the climate and ecology of the North Atlantic. And in 1852, the British looked for any tool they had at their disposal to extract a favorable trading agreement out of the United States. Yet the fisheries would, indeed only could, emerge as this option because of changes in the fishing industry and changes in the ocean itself. Natural forces beyond the control, and at least at the time beyond the understanding of any individual, created the necessary conditions for this conflict to arise. And in the process, this shows us that these natural forces are an important and necessary component to understand the conduct of diplomacy. Without an appreciation for the non-human world, the human histories that we tell are necessarily incomplete. Where history happens matters tremendously to how we understand that history. And so I'll end by offering a few thoughts about the nature of presidential history. Since after all, we are the Center for Presidential History. The presidency as an institution, the presidency as a topic of history, a topic of inquiry, attracts a great deal of interest, right? That's why we are all here. Certainly at times, this kind of traditional political history focused on the power of great men is not necessarily in vogue in the sorts of academic circles that I normally work in, but it is clear that the public has this great interest in this topic, something that Brian certainly alluded to earlier in the work that the CPH does to reach that public. And I think part of the reason why we as Americans are so interested, so fascinated with this institution is the fact that we want to think somebody's in charge. We want there to be somebody who is responsible. We want somebody to celebrate when things go wrong. We want somebody to celebrate when things go right. We want somebody to blame when things go wrong. We want somebody who is in control. But, of course, we know that no individual, no matter how powerful, even the President of the United States, is solely in control of anything. There are a whole variety of forces that constrict, that shape, that operate on the exercise of power at any level. But we also must appreciate that there are forces beyond the control, the influence, or even the understanding of any individual human. The non-human world can, does, and will continue to influence human history. And our histories will be richer, our histories will be more accurate, our histories will be better, and our understanding of our world will be fuller when we recognize that. When we recognize that very often the non-human world is having a significant influence on what unfolds in the human world. And I think what we see in the summer of 1852 illustrates that point, that even something as intensely human as the conduct of politics and diplomacy was itself shaped. I'm not going to say controlled, but I will say shaped by these forces, by these energies, by these trends emanating from the non-human world. Thank you.
Fewer fish puns than I expected. More fish puns. Hold on a second. Oh, here we go. All right. As we usually do, we really want to invite you to participate in this discussion. We've got some time, and so I ask you, we're going to have two microphones. I'll have Zach go to that side, and I'll be on this side. Please put your hand up. I'm going to let Blake kind of guide where the mic goes, but please do wait until the mic gets to you so we can actually hear you, and so that those who are going to watch the recording afterwards will actually be able to hear the question. Okay? So I'll turn it over to Blake, and you want to point us? All right.
Yes, ma'am.
So I guess it's a two-part question. Okay. First of all, why did the Americans think that they had the right to fish in British waters? And second of all, going along with that, did Canadians and Brits have the right to fish in America, right off the American coast?
Okay, so to answer your first question, why did Americans think they had the right to fish? Well, because all of these agreements, stretching back to the Treaty of Paris in 1783, did recognize the right, the liberty of Americans to fish in most waters. It was really only that 3-mile-long strip along the coast that was forbidden to American fishermen. And the real problem came with the Bay of Fundy because as I noted, if we can get back there, the Bay of Fundy is extraordinarily wide. Yeah, and so much of it is outside of that 3-mile line. It's just different kind of legal interpretations of what the law meant that led to this disagreement, the British saying the bay was entirely off limits to Americans, and the Americans saying only that 3-mile strip is off limits. So a lot of it is just kind of disagreements on how to interpret international law. So to get to your second question about whether Canadian and British fishermen had the right to fish in American waters. They did, but American waters were far less prolific, far less rich than Canadian waters further north. So it would not have made sense for Canadian fishermen to come all the way south to American waters to fish. The fisheries near Canada, much richer, much more prolific. So it just wouldn't have made economic sense to come all the way south to, Massachusetts or something when you could just go to the Bay of Fundy.
Hello. Yeah. Great talk.
Thank you.
I love fishing and I love to eat fish. And I have 7 fish tank at home.
Very
But
good.
those are not for eating. Anyway, I heard about some recent event in, I think it's around the Gulf of Mexico, where U.S., I guess, Fish and Wildlife, they have inspectors that will inspect fishing vessels from neighboring countries. So I heard of one story that one inspector went missing and it was never found. So I don't know whether you heard about that. And another interesting fact that I have heard about is a lot of this neighboring country fishing vessels, they, could be entering U.S. water illegally, but they would have a fishing vessels like the real catcher, but then they will offload, it to a normal cargo vessel and then ship it away.
Sure.
So I don't know whether you have, you have knowledge about this and, yeah.
I don't think I'm familiar with the specific incidents that you mentioned there, but certainly kind of international conflict over fishing has by no means gone away with the 19th century. In fact, in some regards, now more than ever, we see international conflict over fishing, especially in the Pacific. As fishing becomes bigger and bigger business, as more and more fish is consumed around the world, kind of the stakes of the international fishing business become much higher. So the kinds of conflicts that you're seeing and this desire to get around laws, to get around regulations is a huge problem with fisheries today. And I think what I would say is that, of course, the economic importance of fisheries can help explain why fishing has become this real hot button topic internationally. But at least what my research in the 19th century shows us is that very often fishing is about so much more than just fish. That fishing is so caught up in these kind of larger political contests. And part of what I kind of saw in the 19th century is that oftentimes Americans are advocating for this expansion of American fishing rights as this kind of leading edge of the expansion of American power. So as we have Americans really concerned with the growth of fishing rights, it's really more about growing American power to places around the globe. So when we see individual nations coming into conflict over these fishing resources, I think very often that it's not just about these resources here, but it's these larger questions about kind of power on the international stage. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you for a great talk. I had 2 questions. I was curious if you were able to find in archival material similar conversations occurring between Canadian fishermen and their elected officials in Canada and by extension England. And then also I was curious if you could expand a little bit more on what role you saw this issue in '52 playing in the presidential election between Fillmore and Pierce.
All right, so that first question there about how these sorts of questions played out in Canada and perhaps in Britain. Well, the Canadians were far more interested in this issue than the British were, right? Because it's the Canadian fishermen who are ultimately, more closely tied to it. The British really just see this as this kind of diplomatic, geopolitical question, whereas plenty of Canadians see it as, food on their tables. So it's a bigger issue in that regard. And, throughout much of the 19th century, you see Canadians really complaining to elected officials about Americans running roughshod over the region. Canadians are really, really kind of opposed to the growing influence and power of the American fishing industry in the region because they think that, quite rightly, Americans are kind of the leading edge of this overfishing crisis. They think that they're taking too many fish, that they are kind of spoiling this economic commons in the North Atlantic. So there's a lot of complaint coming from Canadian fishermen to their, officials higher up, both in Canada and in Britain. Though, of course, there were plenty of Canadians who benefited mightily from the American presence because these American fishermen are also doing plenty of trade with merchants in the region as well. So, American fishermen are in the region and they need to buy wood or tobacco or kind of anything else to sustain their voyage, there are merchants in Canada who are making a lot of money off this as well. But the actual Canadian fishermen are really opposed to the American presence in the region. As far as the dispute's influence on the presidential election that fall. I can't really speak to the extent that this kind of threw the election either way, but during the summer, you do see the press really using this issue, especially the Democratic press, using this issue as a way to kind of beat up on the Fillmore administration and the Whigs. They oftentimes talk about the fisheries dispute as just proof of how weak foreign policy had become under Whig presidents like Fillmore. And kind of we got a sense from that political cartoon as we have the Irishman on the end talking about how we just need the Democrat Franklin Pierce in office, and that'll fix all of these problems. So, kind of unsurprisingly, as we certainly see in our current day, any little issue can be kind of molded back into the old partisan politics frame, and we certainly saw that here. And I think to some extent the presence of the presidential elections did play some role in this issue kind of fading from the headlines, because this actual question is not solved until 1854, but by October, November of 1852, Americans are talking about it a whole lot less, presumably because interest is kind of shifting towards the presidential election. So that's how I kind of see those two things interacting with each other. Yeah.
So this could be a dumb question, but on your on the graph that you had up there with the mackerel and the cod and the tonnage, in I think it was 1834, there was like a gap right when the mackerel overtook the cod. I was just wondering if there was like a reason for that, or
shoddy record keeping, probably. We probably just did not have actual numbers from those years. Could have been lost in a fire, something like that. We can only read the sources that actually survive from the past, but that probably accounts for that little gap there.
Okay, I have two questions. One's immediate and one's maybe something that could help us think about this broadly. Was there a such thing that we might call like the fish lobby? Like, were there actually people who were advocating either going to Washington or organizing to say Webster, support us in the Congress? I know we don't have modern lobbying quite yet.
Right, yeah. So there's not a real coherent fish lobby during this period, in large part because still during this time, The fishing business is pretty decentralized. It's not as though we have these big fishing companies, these big fishing concerns that can, really mobilize political support in that way. So it's a lot of individuals, in the fishing business, kind of the typical kind of organization is kind of an owner-operator situation in which a fisherman would own the boat that he worked on, and usually it was his family members that he worked alongside with on these vessels. But you do see, not just here in 1852, but kind of at other instances, kind of memorials being sent from various cities in Massachusetts that kind of remind those in Washington of the importance of the fishing industry. So there wasn't organized lobbying, but certainly there was contact between ordinary fishermen and their elected officials in Washington in that way. Later on in the century, by the 1860s and the 1870s, the business really becomes consolidated among a number of kind of really large-scale fishing firms in Boston, and then we do see the emergence of a fishing lobby by the 1860s and the 1870s that has a really big impact on kind of the place of fishing in Washington politics. But at this point and earlier, the business is just too fragmented for there to be any kind of effective lobbying.
Okay, we got. Here we go.
On the graph you've got up there, in the 1860s, there's a drastic drop in the cod tonnage, and the mackerel tonnage is more or less constant.
Yeah.
Is that due to what, as far as we know, was there actually a fall in the availability of cod, or was this a purely economic and political decision to go fish for mackerel?
It would be more based in economics and politics. It's not until if this graph were to extend further into the 1880s and the 1890s, we do see a big drop-off because of just cod populations going down. But at this point, in the 1860s, there's not any evidence to suggest that there was less cod fishing going on because there was less cod out there. It has more to do with kind of the politics and the economy of the business here. Yeah.
Another fish question. As I understand it today, the cod fishing population is probably quite a bit lower than those years. And I've heard that most of the cod equivalent fish today is haddock. And so mackerel is not really the same, from an eating consumption point of view, it's not the same as cod. So what happened to that, haddock population back then, and how does it play back then?
What happened to the mackerel population?
I mean, the haddock. That different type of fish that is the equivalent of the cod today.
Oh, the haddock. Well, if we want to talk about kind of global fisheries today, the kind of most dominant species that in some ways occupies the same role as cod is pollock today. So pollock from the North Pacific is kind of the most kind of popular, the most kind of the highest catches of any kind of fin fish in the world. So kind of in that regard, it's more so pollock that has replaced cod as this kind of really important keystone economic species today. Is that?
I'm wondering what happened back then, as far as.
What happened to have this shift from cod to something else?
Yeah, why did it shift from catching cod to
Well, Well, over the course of the 20th century, cod fishes would go up really dramatically, especially after World War II, to the point that there was a significant downturn in the amount of cod caught in the early 1990s. And in fact, both the Canadian and American governments have forbidden the continuation of cod fishing in the North Atlantic since the early 1990s. So that plays a big role in this kind of more recent downturn in cod fishing, at least in the North Atlantic.
I might ask just one final question, because this has got me thinking, like, your broader point about the way in which the environment or the non-human world plays a role in history. Could you maybe give us like another example or two to kind of latch on to that might be in this realm? So, like, I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but I will a little bit. Like, I think about oil, like in Texas, like things that we extract from the environment. Are there other examples that we can latch on to be like, oh, I can see how the non-human world is actually shaping what's going on politically?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're kind of getting at it there, that any story of resource extraction and resource use, be it kind of fishing in the North Atlantic during the 19th century, be it oil production in Texas in the 20th century, be it kind of oil production in the Middle East during the 20th and 21st centuries, that in all these different ways, I think we do need to have this appreciation for how the environmental factors that leads to that situation, the environmental forces that lead to just the availability of those resources at a given place and a given time, will impact how human societies respond to the availability of those resources, which in turn kind of influences the kind of political, economic, sociological, cultural trends around kind of any given resource use. So yeah.
I want to encourage everyone as we close tonight to buy a copy of the book. There's a lot more than obviously can be said in a 45-minute talk. And I also want to thank you again for being here. I know it's time out of your schedule, and we really appreciate that you came to be with us. And I hope that you'll plan to join us for our last event on May 9th, just a couple of weeks from now. So please, again, join me in thanking Blake for speaking with us tonight.
Thank you.